Hey, welcome everyone to Channel 36. I'm AJ Garrett, your host, Channel 36, one of hopefully many transmitters of truth out there, a place to discuss the weird, wacky, and wonderful, discuss things that we're seeing in our culture and times and how they might relate to biblical end times and some of these interesting things. Want to have a discussion here. Is there a relationship between sci-fi or the sci-fi culture that we've been used to over the decades and end times event? So, hey, kick back. I've got a drink here. I'm sitting back here in the studio with some Magnum PI playing in the background for some company, and let's dive into this. I grew up as a kid in the 70s, and science fiction, kind of more in, I guess, a modern sense, is really starting to come into its own in the 70s. So I was a big fan. It really was the backdrop to a lot of my childhood. So I remember, of course, being at a very young age, about mid-70s is what I remember, 75, 76, starting to really watch television and remember kind of what I was watching. And, of course, original episodes of Star Trek and Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and that whole crowd. And actually, I think it was Sunday morning, and I had to wait for that, gosh, horrible, awful show for a kid called Coronation Street to end. And then, try to wait patiently for that, and then Star Trek to start. I remember watching Logan's Run. I remember that movie coming out, watching that. 1999, Space 1999. Martin Landau, BBC, watched that with the Eagle Landers and such, and I had the models. And then most certainly the backdrop really changed in 1977 when Star Wars came out, and I saw that at a drive-in theater, and I believe in June of 77, only a month after the May of 77 release. And man, my childhood changed. I mean, that was the backdrop to my childhood. So my, times after that, and Christmases and birthdays, and especially Christmases, I mean, stockings were full of Star Wars figures and spaceships and, land speeders and all that kind of good stuff. I mean, that was kind of my fantasy backdrop. As I got a little older, I mean, certainly around that time as well on television, Battlestar Galactica came out in 1978, Buck Rogers in 79, Gil Gerard did an awesome, job at that, and then things just kind of motivated forward. E.T., of course, came out in the 80s. We started to see changes in the 80s, and I was certainly a fan of Star Trek The Next Generation when that came out. So that was kind of the backdrop. But as a Christian, as I got saved and gave my heart to the Lord really, I guess probably 1977 as a kid, but really started more to be aware of, I think, spiritual things and experience more spiritual things with the Holy Spirit and with the Lord in about 1982, 83. I remember especially being in the 80s and starting to sense as I look back, I wasn't necessarily as infatuated with sci-fi at that point as I was when I was younger, but still very, it was my culture. Remember sensing there was something off, something a bit wrong. And I remember not really understanding what it was, but there's just something that's off about the sci-fi culture and how it was progressing. And something just kind of tweaked my spirit when it came to that. I remember coming, I think, to a little bit more of a formal position on it when I started to get involved in the late 80s, early 90s with Christian Research Institute when I was living in Toronto, or CRI, and Walter Martin wrote the book The Kingdom of the Cults, which is kind of an absolute reliable text on the Christian cults and other cults and so forth. And Walter Martin said in his opinion that the last deception would be around flying saucers, aliens, those types of things. And I remember going, whoa, what's he talking about? And as I started to kind of mull these things over, I started to absolutely believe that, without question, I think this could be the explanation for, let's say, the delusion that will be essentially put upon the earth to explain massive changes that are going to occur, from anything from a rapture to changes in government to changes in these types of things. And let's backpedal a bit. One of the backdrops to this, and I'm kind of throwing a lot of stuff at the wall right now. And there's going to be people listening to this that are well familiar. I mean, maybe more educated than I am for sure. And there are absolutely folks I will direct you to that have done some amazing work on some of this stuff. Elie Marzulli, without question. There's a whole bunch of guys that have done a lot of, really in-depth research on these things and so forth. And I'm just hoping that Channel 36 can just be another place that people can get a little more info on it. But it amazes me that there are a lot of believers that don't just have no vantage point on these things. And I believe that there are certain keys here that could really help us see and understand the things that are unveiling in front of us. And hey, take it, pray about it, and so forth. I mean, you got to make up your own mind on these things. But I think one of the bigger backdrops here is the thread that we see as far as demonic or satanic strategy dealing with mankind that literally goes from Genesis 3:15, or proto-evangelium, when there was a promise of a Messiah, right through to our current day in 2020. A thread that goes all throughout this that connects certainly with end times events, and that is essentially the reality of interdimensional beings being here on this planet and having genetic interface, okay, with the human race. And let me get a little more specific with it. Number one, Satan never seems to be very creative. He's just consistent, persistent, and he knows humanity very, very well and has figured out what men will fall for and how to be able to play with that. But going all the way back, it seems, and I'm using loose terms here, or we could essentially have a discussion on any one of these elements in themselves for hours. But essentially, going all the way back, it seems that the key plan of the enemy to stop the coming of a Messiah, as mentioned in Genesis 3:15, essentially was to contaminate human genetics so that an actual Messiah a pure Messiah could not be born into this, into this dimension. So what do you have? Again, you have what many believe in the Bible. I certainly do. Are an account of fallen angels that mated with women. Okay, so we have interdimensional beings, angelic fallen angels that essentially mate with women, and the offspring of those things are the giants, and that's obviously that is a classic interpretation of those scriptures when it comes to that issue. You originally, it is often believed that the first of those offspring were the Titans, that were even far larger than the giants that we even find out about a little further in the Old Testament. But we have the Book of Enoch that talks about that. Put the brakes on. I'm not saying that the Book of Enoch is canon or accepted as being biblically approved that way, but it was definitely real. The Book of Enoch was written during that time period. The Bible references Enoch. I mean, my goodness me, so you can't laugh at Enoch. You can't laugh at the reality of this book. And I would argue, isn't it interesting, like many would probably argue, that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Book of Enoch's in there. I mean, Enoch seems to be a potential source or a resource for end times. So anyways, if you take a chance, I encourage you to read the Book of Enoch. Again, I'm not saying it's biblical canon. Don't read it with those eyes, but just take a look at essentially what it's saying and what's going on there. And there is an absolute explanation of what happened from the angels falling, mating with men and women, mating with women. I'm maybe even both. But offspring came, of course, from women. The reality of it, that seemingly being so, that a tremendous amount of fallen angel or supernatural wisdom was given from the demonic, from the fallen angels, rather, to humanity, which could very much explain why things got so bad before the flood. A question I think worthy of another discussion at some other point was what really happened, by the time of the flood. Something that was always a bit of a mystery to me was the fact that, okay, if we read the accounts of what things were like before the flood, when there was this big cataclysm that every quote-unquote religion or faith in the world will talk about, every culture seems to have a flood myth to it, or have a flood story to it. We get a picture from the Bible that what were they doing? Well, they were evil, they were murdering people, doing sexually bizarre things, etc. Well, mankind's always done that stuff. I mean, today they're still doing that stuff. And I would suggest that, in looking, without getting too far into it, I would suggest that very, very likely they were absolutely far, far in advance what the evil and the things that they were tangling with, especially through the help or assistance of fallen angels and wisdom and things that Enoch seems to certainly allude to. They were far, far in advance. And I think that one then very simply explains why we look at the ancient world. We have no flipping clue how they built the pyramids. I mean, they were putting huge monoliths together, okay, massive stones worth, weighing tons and tons, putting them together with precision that you couldn't even slide a razor blade between them. I mean, we can't come remotely close to that. From the Nazca lines being only understood from space to, again, taking a look at the Stonehenge and so forth. I mean, seemingly a global system. Well, they never, supposedly from the science and the history we've learned, they were never even close. So it doesn't make sense. How could they have done those things? Well, I think the answer is all tied up into that. But in any case, the bottom line is a flood came, wiped everything out. Was said about Noah, of course, is that his genetics or gene line was pure. That we can't ignore, and we'll get into that in another time. But there was something special about Noah and his lineage that made it something that could endure beyond the flood by God's plans. And this is what happens. Now, of course, we see that Josh and Caleb and the boys had to deal with the giants again. You see that these offspring of arguably fallen angels and women are back again. But we essentially have, this whole thing is about the contamination of genetics. Now, it's very, very interesting that when we get into the modern era, let's come back to, we'll go to World War II, that in the 1940s, what we see in the 1940s is that apps from Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, we see a ton of stuff that occurs from 1947 forward. We see that the Nazi Empire, through their massive pursuit of the occult and the Vril Society and all the things that they were doing, we see some things really happen in 1947 that from that moment forward that there is a massive explosion, okay, of occult UFO type phenomenon. One of the absolute characteristics or byproducts of that being alien abduction, and the biggest, let's say, byproduct of the alien abduction experience or thing that's tied with that is being operated on and messing with human genetics. We see exactly the same thing. Now, what I noticed was, and when I'm talking about a tie to or a relationship between the science fiction culture and potentially end times events, is something I noticed, and I believe that the Lord showed me this in my spirit, or something I was sensitive to. There is a real evolution of, if you understand there's an evolution of thought that has occurred as science fiction in our popular culture has evolved since the 60s, 70s, well, since the 40s or 50s, War of the Worlds. There's been a major change in evolution of how that has directed our culture to see, perceive, and then view the issue of quote-unquote UFOs, alien races, all those types of things. And it is demonic, and it absolutely falls into line rather with, I think, some of the global lies that the Antichrist lies that we're going to see happening. If you see the original, ever go back for fun and watch a couple of them. There was in the 1950s, there was in the 40s and 50s, there was, some of the first movies on this stuff one was called the Alien That Ate My Buick. Not kidding, look it up. All right. The idea was originally when there was sci-fi movies were coming out, War of the Worlds, there was like these robotic crazy creatures that were, would be walking down the streets and everyone was screaming and running. I mean, that was it. We were scared of them. We were afraid of them, run the other way. And I mean, there was no connection between us and them whatsoever. But enter Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek in the 1960s. All of a sudden that starts to change. And Star Trek, of course, was massive. I mean, the influence of Star Trek as an original franchise original series was absolutely incredible, even though it was quite short-lived on the air originally. But here we have in Star Trek, the original Kirk, Spock, and McCoy version, we've got for the first time aliens actually working now with humans. Now, they weren't necessarily all cuddly, and it's funny, go back and watch this. They weren't all cuddly, and there was still somewhat a bit of a distance with them, but there was friendships that were forming. You had Spock, right? You had different characters, that were appearing. And so what we see is that, aliens are real, they're out there, but they're kind of, they're a part of the intergalactic family, they're cousins. We still don't fully get them, but we are working together with them, etc. And it's interesting because wound into the narrative of the original Star Trek was also a very multicultural theme and multi-country theme. So not only, I think there's an unconscious extension. So not only do you have, Uhura, who is an African-American woman, you have Sulu, who is Chinese, okay, Scotty, who is the, classic Scotsman. We've got people from all these countries. You also now have aliens that are just like, they're just kind of like another cousin out there from another country. This is what we're being bred to see. Now, it takes another jump in the 80s. Once we get into the 80s, we now get the emotional connection. E.T., basically pointing his glowing finger, I'm in here, and there's a relationship. He wants to go home. We're trying to help him. We love him. And there's a very emotional tie. We start to see, getting into the 80s, especially with Next Generation and Star Wars and some of these things, we start to see actually more intimate. Look at Han Solo and Chewbacca. I mean, they are best friends. They are just lifelong best friends. So we start to see a more intimate tie, that they're not only cousins out there that we interact with, they are family to us. So there's an emotional heart tie. You get into the 90s, we start to see we're even sexually mating with these things now. Okay, we get into some other elements of Star Trek and other movies, Starman, some of these types of things. There absolutely are intimate relationships. So we have been bred to the point now where I'm going to just finish watching Star Trek Picard, that was created by CBS, the latest installment of the Star Trek franchise, aired over Crave. They've done one season so far. I'm going to actually give a review on that, because as happy as I was to see it come out, because I'm a big Star Trek Next Generation fan, I was just blown away by the level of occult messaging and other messaging within it. I mean, you got to see it for what it is. You got to recognize what's there. We are being conditioned. There's no question about it. So that being said, we have it moving to a 2020 state where it's even darker when it comes down to that. So to kind of tie things up for this chat, I think really, where does the tie come in? We are being prepared. There has been the UFO phenomena has exploded so massively since the 1940s. We get into the UFO flaps in the 50s and 60s and all these types of things, that as the UFO alien abduction phenomenon grew, especially in the 80s, that even our largest Ivy League schools were all doing research and studies on the phenomenon. My point is, you can't laugh at it. People make it laughable, but there were so many doctors, lawyers, police officers, firemen, teachers, professors, you name it, okay, professionals with no former psychiatric problems, no criminal records in their background and anything of the sort, that so many folks from professional, credible backgrounds were having these experiences and being experimented on and operated on and everything, that they've had to do studies on this stuff. What we see now is we're on the brink, basically, for years now. We believe alien disclosure, that these creatures or things have been here interacting with us, probably all the way back, is what the messaging is going to say. This is the whole ancient aliens trend, that they're even really our birth fathers, and they gave birth to us and planted us here, and we really come from them and all this stuff. But we are on the brink of an absolute evolution of awareness that these creatures and things are here. We accept it now. It's well over 50%. I should know the stat. If I'm talking about it, I apologize, but it is a very sizable amount now of people that are willing to say, yes, I believe in UFOs, I believe in extra-dimensional beings and all the rest of it. We have come a long way as far as the culture is concerned. So we're not only in the brink of, we believe, disclosure that these things are here and that they exist, but that seemingly very likely the lie from that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 references, by way of an excuse for an illusion or a delusion that will be spread, that will be the fact that we will have to explain the massive changes in our world coming for an antichrist government, one world government, to come into play, whether it's government, cultural, even environmental changes, okay, let alone possibly the excuse for a rapture where you have millions of people that have disappeared, will be the appearance of these interdimensional beings in physical form, basically saying, we are here, and we've had either to remove people from the planet that are not ready for this next stage of evolution, for example, or we are here to solve all your health problems, your economic problems, and whatnot. We've got a chip to take that will change your DNA. We've got all these. We are on the brink of that, and we have been conditioned, in my opinion, from the cycle, from the sci-fi culture right to this point, to accept that. Another element of this is, and I'm going to wrap up. Another element of this is the New Age movement. I mean, which started to come into view in the 1980s in North America, starting with Transcendental Meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and some of those types of things. But when you get into the New Age movement and the kind of the evolution of trance channelers and the things they've said, there's a whole strand or stream of channelers New Age channelers that would claim to channel the messaging from aliens. And their messages always have been from the very beginning the same. We are coming. We're about to enter a new evolution of consciousness. We're going to be here. We're going to be showing up, and we're going to show you how to change your world and all this kind of stuff. By the way, we may have to remove some people that aren't ready for this and send them to a re-education planet, etc. But every angle, my friends, that you look at, there is a massive, massive relationship between the alien interdimensional being element of this and the end times. And, just one other thing that comes to mind right off the top of my head. If you look back, and I could dig the names up, you could find them, but two of the founding quote-unquote ufologists, okay, going all the way back, are two men that really did a lot to kind of birth a study on this. One's an American, one's a Frenchman. The American, actually, Steven Spielberg, in his 1977 movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, actually tipped the hat a little bit to this gentleman. They put this guy in the landing party of the main craft at the end of the movie comes down. He's in that scene as one of the scientists there, just to kind of give him some respect. Both of these founding and leading ufologists believe that these beings that we believe are here now and that are going to be appearing in a greater visual way, that they are not as much beings from a distance in another physical place. So in other words, I'm from Chicago and dude over here is from Detroit. We're just from a distance, but we're basically the same. They believe that they are quote unquote interdimensional beings that are more angelic and demonic in character. I had the chance to talk to actor Dan Aykroyd about this. I've met Dan through some circumstances I won't get into here, but sat down one summer on a dock at a cottage and talking to him, and because Dan his family has a real background in the occult, and he's a big believer in the alien equation, alien agenda, and all the rest of that, and he's of the same belief as well, that they're interdimensional. I asked him about that, and he said, yeah, I firmly believe that. So my friends, there you go. There's a little bit of math on this stuff, and all I'm trying to suggest here is especially if you're a believer or you're trying to make sense of these types of things, we are going to see more and more of this stuff brought to the forefront. There is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, that there's a direct relationship. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew 24, at the time of his return or coming, okay, do not be deceived. That was the biggest warning. And he said also, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the time of his return. Well, what was going on in the days of Noah? Well, we had giants. We had interdimensional beings that had bred, okay, genetically with humans. Offspring came of that, and we had hybrid humans and these non-terrestrial creatures, the DNA mixed, and we had physical offspring from that walking around. So it's kind of hard to argue. The stuff's there. Whether you want to believe it or not is up to you. And with any of this as well, I don't want to get into some at this point some big debate on the rapture and pre, mid, and post, pre-wrath, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm pre-trib myself, but the reality is, however you look at it, if an antichrist is going to be here at some point, the world has to massively, massively change. I believe we're seeing it now, no question, but the alien equation is absolutely a part of that, and the conditioning of the science fiction movement over the decades to now has absolutely, I believe, put us on that front doorstep. Guys, you have a great night. God bless, and we will talk at you soon.
This is a journey into sound.
It is time